The Gospel reading today brings together three stories of healing. One is about a tax collector who got up from his desk and left it all behind. One is about a bleeding woman who was on the fringe. And one is about a young dead girl who received a hand in her own. And between story 1 and 2, set in the context of a meal, there is a wisdom saying from the book of Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Sacrifice could be translated in a modern amplified way as anything related to the worship of God, like prayers, singing, readings, communion, all things that our forebears usually imbued with a holy hue. And mercy, in the words of the moral theologian James Glynn, is the willingness to enter into the chaos of others. It's a way of being, seeing, and responding to others. And in Hosea, and in the Jesus communities that formed the Gospel of Matthew, entering the chaos of others is to have priority over entering into the activities of worship. Dining with tax collectors and sinners, for example, was to enter into the chaos of others, and thereby into the very kingdom of God. As an aside, the influential monk and theologian of the 1960s, Thomas Merton, thought the best name for God was mercy, entering into the chaos of others. These three stories may or may not have an historical basis in the ministry of Jesus. Instead of assuming facticity, we need to start with Jesus' groups in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, in the late 1st century, some 60 plus years after Jesus' death. For it is likely that the stories of the tax collector, the hemorrhaging woman, and the sick girl resonated with the lived experience of people in those Jesus groups. They were people on the fringe, on the margins of society, Jewish in a Gentile world. As the biblical author Warren Carter says, the Jesus groups welcome to their meals despised people marginalized by others, whether by occupation, gender, religious non-observance, socio-economic status, actions, and so on. Jesus groups formed an open, alternate, inclusive community society not constituted by conventional status markers like wealth and ethnicity and gender hierarchies. Maybe in that alternate meal context, members of these groups told their personal stories, stories of friendship, stories of hardship too, stories of exploitation, stories of being violated and violence. Not unlike what Desmond Tutu and his fellow panelists heard during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in the late 90s. Stories of enduring shame and suffering. And in the telling, finding some healing, more or less, some repowering of their lives. And maybe in the telling they connected their stories with other earlier stories in the Jesus movement. And those stories have come down to us in texts, like the one in our service today. For this is the power of story, to hear in it our own, to allow it to offer some healing, to hear in the story some hope. So, story 1. It's about a man who worked for the violent invaders, the Romans, by collecting money, by fair means or foul, to prop up their empire, but also to profit his own purse. Tax collectors took a percentage, sometimes a large percentage, of the takings for their own. Tax collectors were characterized as thieves, thugs, and Roman lackeys. It was thus an occupation of shame. The one who did it was seen as unclean, ritually impure. It's kind of like working for big tobacco when we knew that tobacco killed people. And money, though it did and still does, regardless of its source, bring a semblance of respect, most ordinary people, out of earshot of the authorities, were scathing and scornful of tax collectors. You wouldn't want one to marry your daughter. This story is one verse long. Jesus came, disrupted, and left. And Matthew followed. Matthew chose to leave behind the position of power, security of money and status, and join this alternate community, an alternate to the standard operating procedures, the SOPs of the empire. The text identifies the critics of both Jesus and Matthew as Pharisees. We need to be careful with this word, lest we fall into the anti-Semitic assumptions of the past. The Pharisaic movement was a broad-based reform movement, taking the understandings of faith and worship from the Jerusalem temple into synagogues throughout the country and homes. Jesus was part of this movement. Yes, Jesus was a Pharisee. It's like labeling the critics of Lloyd Gearing leading up to the 1967 heresy trial as Presbyterian, and then going on to assume every Presbyterian thought the same and wanted him found guilty. Whereas, as we know, Lloyd was himself Presbyterian, and the majority of Presbyterians at that General Assembly cleared him of all charges. So it's much better to understand Jesus' critics in our text today as an elite alliance of religious leaders opposed to Jesus or disquieted by Jesus, and as members of the governing class committed to maintaining a hierarchical status quo. The other word in this part of the text, sinners, likewise needs to be dealt with thoughtfully. For then, as now, it's a useful marker for anyone you dislike or disagree with. Like the word heretic. In this context, it was particularly used of women by traditionalists who did not approve of their presence at public meal tables. Such women were regularly labelled as prostitutes or slaves, regardless of their social status or role at the meal. Story 2. The sick child and her important father. But note this story is purposely woven into story 3, the sick woman. This is a process called intercalation. We're meant to read both stories in the light of the other. Both are about women, one young, one old. Both are about suffering. One suffering for 12 years, one dying from her suffering. Remember, there was no morphine back then. Both have crossed the socially constructed barrier between the clean and unclean, the defiled and undefiled, the religiously acceptable and the religiously unacceptable. One through bleeding, one through death. Both touch and are touched by Jesus, thus also defiling him. One touches the fringe, the tassel of his prayer shawl, and one Jesus takes by the hand. which is probably one of the most radical verses in the whole of the Christian scriptures. Young girls were on the bottom of society's power pyramid. In most places they still are. And she is dead, defiled, polluted by death. But Jesus takes her hand. He reaches into the stigma, the chaos, the suffering of this wee outsider, and invites her, indeed all those marginalized, into a different, alternate future. I don't believe Jesus resuscitated her, or that her carers had misinterpreted her symptoms and erroneously thought she was dead, or that she was just sleeping, or that God and Jesus suspended the divide between death and life and brought one who was dead back alive again. Rather, this is story, not a modern-day medical examination and intervention. What I do believe is that Jesus had the courage called faith and inspired people to carry on after his death, that courage by forming groups of misfits who would enter into the chaos of one another's lives. What I do believe is that men in despised and shameful occupations, like that tax collector on that day in that tax booth, found the courage called faith in these groups of Jesus' followers. What I do believe is that women suffering from the stigma of long-term sickness, long-term shaming, long-term labeling, found the courage called faith to join this table fellowship of misfits, of impure people. And in that acceptance, in this storytelling, found too a healing. They were loved and they belong. What I do believe is that young girls, dependent and suffering, can experience the courage called faith from people who love them, parents, caregivers, and people who take hold of their hand, reaching across the barriers to gently invite them into alternate possibilities. Possibilities that bring life, not death, that bring promise, not pain. Our task, calling if you like, as a Jesus group today is simply to enter into the chaos of others' lives, especially those on the fringes of power, social acceptability, especially to those who are suffering, and invite them into alternate, accepting, and inclusive communities, and to build such communities. Invite them into an oasis of mercy, as Pope Francis once said. Trusting our experience that in being loved and belonging, trusting our experience of mutuality and respect that we have found, and that this can be the experience of others and a source of hope. Blessings to you this week.